Namaskar and welcome to this exciting session. And the topic that we have chosen is we have the best person to discuss with us. We have been hearing the topics of Satanism and paganism for most of our Native Americans and also Hindus also included in a big way. If you look at the writings of early Christian colonialists, and their main objective was to teach some manners to the heathens or the pagans of the world. Well, believe me, the pagans make up more than 1.5 billion people on this planet today, or more, probably more. And and they have sustained their culture. They have sometimes more values, and they have not exploited anyone. So let us discuss what is this paganism and how we can debunk this paganism completely from a rational point of view. So without delay, let's welcome Sri Kam Carpentier or Mr. Kam Carpentier from New Delhi.
Thank you, and good morning to you. I hope you can hear me
Yes.
well. Since we are addressing an academic audience, I like to refer to etymologies. And as most people know, paganism is rooted in the paganus, in the word paganus, which essentially means a peasant or a rural inhabitant. And it evokes the fact that when Christianity spread in the West, it spread mostly in urban areas and in the beginning mostly in the poorer urban neighborhoods. But the peasants remained largely faithful for centuries to their traditional cultures and ways of worship. And even when they became Christian, nominally and formally, they most of the time combined their traditional worship with Christian rituals. And this perdured in some parts of Europe right until the dawn of the 20th century, in places as different as France, Poland, Italy, the Balkans, and even Scandinavia. Obviously, there was a lot of concern on the part of the churches, the Catholic Church and then the Protestants, as to the fact, regarding the fact that there was this very vivid permanence and resistance from traditional pre-Christian religions. Because here you come to the fundamental definition of religion as it came to be in the West, right from, I would say, the early Middle Age. And at that point, it became clear to the authorities in matters of theology that they had to define their faith as against previous forms of worship and mystical beliefs. And religion acquired its very Eurocentric characteristic, although it was originally Semitic from the Near East, from West Asia, which essentially meant that a religion was a path that had been blazed by a prophet or a divine figure, and that people therefore had to follow this founder, believe in his teachings, follow his lessons, whether they were in a book or in a verbal, oral form, and that made them Christian or Muslim or Jewish, and therefore believers in their respective religions. Of course, between them, there was usually no love lost, so they tended to qualify each other as wrong beliefs, and they called each other heretics or unbelievers, or in Arabic, kufara, those who are covering up the truth. Or in the case of Christians, they call them pagans and idolaters, which is an old biblical Jewish term. Now, what's very interesting is that idols or icons are images. But in the case of idols, they took a very pejorative characteristic because they were seen as figures that were worshipped instead of the true God, which means that people were waylaid, they had lost the path of truth, and they were worshipping useless images, pieces of wood or paintings or metal. Whereas icons were allowed within Christianity because they represented truly the figures of the Son of God, Christ, or even God the Father, Virgin Mary, the saints, the angels, archangels, all that hierarchy. Whereas in other religions, such as Islam, icons were not allowed either. Images were not to be represented because there was strict monotheism. Now, that brings us to the fact that, by definition, these three religions define themselves as religions in the full sense of the word because they had one God. And this became accepted almost as a scientific fact that if you don't believe in one God, you got it wrong. You just haven't got to the point of maturity that makes you into a cultivated and enlightened human being. And to the point that even today, most people feel that polytheism denotes a level of ignorance and primitiveness. And when you think of it, there is absolutely no scientific basis for this. It's just a habit that has been inculcated in us. And we tend to believe, if we don't learn otherwise, that the first step for someone who wants to become spiritual, truly religious, is to believe in one God. And then, of course, most materialists today, most scientifically minded people will say, and then if you rise above that, then you don't need any God at all, because everything is science, and therefore the universe is a great mechanic that doesn't require any supernatural founder or father or ruler. So that is, of course, where most of our societies are, the so-called liberal, secular society, which tolerates religions but doesn't really give them a lot of place or credence, or in spite of the cultural importance they retain. So that is why, first and foremost, I want to clarify that paganism, whether it's in India, in the Americas, in Russia, Central Asia, Africa, anywhere in the Pacific, it is essentially a collective definition of people who continue to worship psychic and natural forces, which they see as diverse, but generally as connected through a common source. And therefore, any pagan who understands the higher aspects of his religion can tell you that in the end we believe in one ultimate spirit, the great spirit of the Indians, Parabrahman of the Hindus, and Nirvana of the Buddhists. This is a more complex issue. As you know, in many countries, they still don't admit a religion unless that a religion is a religion unless it has one God and one founder. In the case of Hinduism, which is probably the strongest and most widely followed so-called pagan religion, there is a bewildering variety of deities and spirits of nature, which are either natural spirits or conscious forces. But there is no doubt in any Hindu that in the end, the ultimate undefinable truth lies in one great supraconsciousness, if you want to call it that way. And therefore, all these images, all these icons, all these idols, if you want to call them that way, because originally idol had nothing negative to it, are ways of representing this unique, formless, undefinable, creative and sustaining and also destructive force. And that is why, for a pagan or for a Hindu, there is no conflict between being religious and being rational, contrary to what most Westerners are taught to believe, or what most, let's say, monotheists are taught to believe. Because if you understand that the universe is made up of many different manifestations, you can certainly choose to honor, worship all or any of those manifestations and derive a lot of strength and peace from that. So you don't have to try to explain why God is not always good. And I think that is a great default, I would say, of monotheism, which shows you that God is good, but then when something bad happens, it says that, God obviously didn't want it, but it let it happen. And many people have lost their faith for that very reason. If you ask most atheists in the world, they tell you, I don't believe in God because I lost my mother when I was an infant, and that was so cruel and so unfair. Therefore, why did God not save my mother? And that sort of incident in a personal destiny is sufficient to make people believe that, in fact, God is an illusion. It's a form of superstition which has been brought into our lives by the church and the state, and therefore that we're better off without it. Now, in a Hindu or in an American Indian, there is no such conflict because the universe, by definition, exists since we are in it and we're part of it. And therefore, any aspect of the universe that you worship is bound to be there. You don't have to judge whether he's actually good or bad or moral or immoral or why he didn't do this or why he didn't help you to become a millionaire or why he took away your health when you were still a young person. All those things are created by the very, I would say, relativistic and subjective notion that God is essentially a good king somewhere in heaven and that he means well, but for some reason he lets a lot of wrong things happen, and that's probably because there is a devil and he and the devil are in a sort of continuous fight. But then, since he's obviously more powerful than the devil, because otherwise he wouldn't be God, then why does he let the devil do so much harm? You see, so as a result, people either tend to give up on the whole thing, or sometimes, and that is worse, they tend to say, why not worship the devil? Which again is where the accusation of paganism comes from. Aha, so now you are worshiping evil powers. Therefore, you are a Satanist. And unfortunately, we see a lot of that happening, especially in Western societies, for the very reason which I just evoked.
So number one thing which comes to in USA, I can say that more and more people, they find more logic and reasoning in so-called I call it pagan as a pejorative term, in the native cultures. We have seen more and more Americans trying out sweat lodges, believing in Native American spirits, believing in the nature. It's increasing tremendously now. So I think when we say paganism now, so almost returning back to the native cultures, original cultures with a pre-Christianity is a big movement. And also the concept of multiple people managing the affairs of the world seems far more logical than to reject a superimposed idea because you don't know what it is, or to protect the reputation of the church and call everyone as pagan just so that you can find some more acceptance in the church. Now, these type of colonial mindsets and also the insecure mindsets, I would say, that is being challenged uh, by the social media, as well as by more and more people are communicating, and they are finding it more logic and reasoning in the ancient cultures of USA and also in India more and more. But in the new countries where the church has entered recently, or where the church finds maximum non denominational people, they are still continuing their bad propaganda of paganism, like in the villages of India. When they go to convert, missionaries go to convert, there they are very openly talking about paganism. But in USA and all the people that I can see a lot of people nodding in the back. In the USA, and other places, the native cultures which were rejected by the church are now coming back into vogue because of the irrelevance of this dogmatic idea or accusations of paganism. So, what do you think is going to be the future looking like of all the people who are ex-Christians, ex-Muslims, and ex who were taught against idolaters? The idolaters are bad, but now they are also coming back to the old that was better, more freedom was there. They could have done more things with their own life. What do you think of this new movement coming, gradually growing now?
As you know, this movement is not new because it began, at the very least, in the 1960s with the quest for a new form of society, flower children's movement. and associated phenomena, which was widely inspired by Oriental connections. India, Aldous Huxley, and Japan and China with Alan Watts, and so many others. So that is a trend which in America was inevitably inspired by the pre-Columbian American cultures. And unfortunately, it's not easy to rebuild religious and spiritual traditions which have been thoroughly devastated. So you find that very few people understand and are able to build a comprehensive and consistent worldview, because we only get fragments. And in fact, I found that many shamans and other spiritual teachers from South America and Mexico were actually getting inspiration and a better understanding of their own traditions out of a dialogue with Hindu and Buddhist teachers, monks, and gurus. Because both Hinduism and Buddhism provide a complete framework of philosophy, what you call Sattology, which is traditionally called mythology, poetry, epic history. All those elements are there, so you get a complete worldview, a complete vision, which of course has been largely wiped out in, particularly the Americas, but even in Africa, where most people are define themselves now as either Christian or Muslim, and therefore have abandoned a lot of their own traditions. Plus, Hinduism has the benefit of being both a vibrant culture, which in certain aspects you can find called tribal, but it also has a very highly developed intellectual and literary culture, which is not always the case for traditional religions, which are generally more of the religions of the spoken word than of the text, of the writing. So as a result, Hinduism provides, as well as, for example, Taoism in China, or the traditions of various Buddhist traditions of Tibet or Japan or Southeast Asia, which provide you with the ability to understand the universe both in scientific terms, very much in keeping with what is coming out of current physics and biology, but also from a historical perspective with regard to the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of understanding. So that gives us a wholesome, a holistic vision. And it's particularly important to realize that even monotheism is a very late interpretation of the original Semitic traditions. This is not about the Bible, but if you go about the Bible, you realize that it is obviously a collection of texts, many of which were borrowed from pre-Jewish Semitic traditions, from Sumeria, from Egypt, from Egypt they were not Semitic as such, but from, let's say, the Fertile Crescent, the Near East. And out of that came the Bible, and the God of the Bible first was seen pretty much as a collective entity. He was called Elohim, which is a plural term, and he was called Yod-Heh-Vod-Heh, Yehovah, which is undefinable, but he manifested as fire, as a column of fire. And then you realize that Moses calls him Il-Dabaoth, or Sabaoth, which means the Lord of the armies, of the hosts, in the plural. Now, of course, this has been interpreted by some warlords to say, okay, he's the Lord of our armies, the Lord guides us, he's going ahead and fighting for us. But originally it meant that he was the head of a whole array of godheads or angels. So there you don't have monotheism, you have actually what you might define as polytheism. And that's why the angels have survived in Judaism and in Christianity. And the angels, in all their hierarchy, there are 9 levels. You realize that they are actually, you can call them devas, and you can call them asuras if they are fallen angels. So you find the same, I would say, cosmology in original pre-Christian tradition. Then, of course, this was highly regimented in order to make sure that God would be alone, and then he would have a son, which by itself is a contradiction to the fact that there is only one God. And then, of course, they brought in the Holy Spirit. That means there is one God in 3, so you are back to a form of Trinity, if you want to call it that way. But all I'm trying to say here is that there is no such sharp division originally between what we call monotheism and polytheism. It has come out later for all sorts of political reasons, which essentially were intended to separate people who followed a particular path from other people. Why? Because you want people to be faithful to a hierarchy, you want them to obey orders, and you don't want them to mix with people who belong to a different tradition. Otherwise, you might lose them altogether.
Now, in the academic circles in which where most of us work we work with these professors, and this somehow looks like the time has stopped. They're still connected to the old world philosophies, and some of them are gradually changing. Not all of them, but the majority of them are still in the old world when they teach the students. But my point comes from experience. So when you experience a higher dimension while performing, today is a World Yoga Day in US. So here today, when you experience through pranayam, yoga, you experience a higher consciousness, you experience more peace. And so when you experience such kind of emotions, then then there is no hope for any kind of accusation or negative thought process of undermining other people's culture. Now, I'll give you an example of Tanzania, a tribe in Tanzania. They have been living, and it's one of the more, uh, I would say, original areas of Africa left, a beautiful countryside. And the way they live their life based on calculating their time, based on the sun movement, the moon movement, and living on the nature, it has become a far more better model than most of us follow while living in the cities. We have so much anxieties, and plus we have so much hatred about other people. Institutionalized hatred, like hatred against paganism or idolaters, is institutionalized in Islam and also many parts of the church. So, which is better? So experience is better, or some kind of a propaganda is better? So in most of the people's view in today's modern times, experience has a far better is far better than just a dogmatic idea of putting somebody down. What do you say?
Experience is definitely the path that all spiritual teachers advocate, sure, uh, point to. But experience requires preparation. Not everybody can have an experience unless he has gone through quite a lot of spiritual evolution. So clearly there has to be some sort of, I'm not saying it should be an academic preparation. For some people it will be academic, for others it will be a series of connections to other people or to certain books that will put them on the path. And then eventually they'll experience, that's a transcendent experience, the cosmic experience. It has been alluded to in so many different ways, all the way in America from Emerson, and to the oceanic experience was another term used. But, there was a Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, who experienced it while he was going around the Earth in the Apollo 6 rocket capsule. So these kind of experiences eventually can open up, not for everybody. Unfortunately, I think many people don't have that opportunity, and they essentially follow what they are taught. So when they hear in school or in the family that this is the way to go, and that is the true God, and that's how you worship Him, well, they tend to not to discuss it. They just follow, and then it becomes a habit, and then they become very uncomfortable when they connect with anything else, when they meet with anything else, because for them, it's what you call cognitive dissonance. They say, how can I make sense out of this? I was brought up as a strict Christian or as something else, and yet I find something which is not at all matching what I was told to do and believe. So that's, of course, a problem. And unfortunately, people who don't have the experience, they have no real reason to change their course. They will continue doing what they were told to do. And if they don't no longer believe in the path that they were put on in their childhood, they may just get out altogether and not have any path left. I mean, they basically become run-of-the-mill materialists who say, there is nothing to life except trying to make money and have a, comfortable existence until we die. So that's essentially the outcome of many losses of spiritual guidance. But there is not too much we can do about that except provide the opportunity. I think the positive aspect of what's happening now is that a lot of people are getting exposure to other path and they can open their minds. Of course, we can see there are reactions which go in the opposite direction, like all reactions do, which means that people get very, hold on to a particular religion and say, no, this is the truth, and I'm not going to listen to anyone else because they are actually going to take me away from the truth. So that is something which is there with us since the beginning of civilization, I suppose. A certain stubbornness, because for people it becomes part of their identity. So it's very hard for them to open up, and even less so to change their habits.
Today, in many places, especially in the campuses, we see that many people who migrate from Middle East, so they may be belonging to Muslim faith or any other faith. There are Druze from Israel, and there are Muslims, and there are Yazidi from Iraq and Kurdistan. Kurds are there, Afghanis are there. One common thing, I work a lot with that community. One common thing that I find, they all have appreciation for yoga. Everybody. So yoga is something which is binding them together in many ways because it helps them to find their inner self and go deep into themselves. A simple pranayama exercise, a 12-round pranayama exercise, fills them up with pride. So what I've seen is that even though they don't like idolaters because it's been trained in them from the birth that idolaters are evil according to their faith, and many of them go wild extremes. But it was very interesting for me to note that they were going against their institution, which is a mosque. And so even though they were liking what they were experiencing, but they could not openly express it. There was a fear. And so they had to condemn idolater. And when they find out that as a Hindu and I believe in something which is they may not like, but like me, there are 1.5 billion people who love what I do. And so for them it's an eye opener. Like nobody told them that there are so many people who had this kind of thought process and backed by very solid evidence, scriptural evidence, and oftentimes more bigger and more richer than what they had ever experienced. So the kind of information, I would say information blocks that they are locked into and not being, so when they open up, they explode. And so many of them become yoga teachers because I've seen that they come from a background where they were suppressed and to such an extent that they could not come out. And now suddenly they found this new freedom and they want to share it with the whole world. Yeah, so they're becoming yoga teachers, they're becoming philosophers and all those kind of things. So the the entire culture of paganism depends on a very strong institutional block or institutional suppression, and that's where the hatred of paganism continues to simmer, whether you call it idolaters or you call it pagans or you call it heathens or whatever word you kafirs, but still is the same thing when you're talking same thing. So this is the last question I have, so please tell us. So,
Yes, you see, one, yoga is definitely an eye opener, a mind opener, a soul opener, and because it proceeds from the essentially the unfoldment of the body and its harmonization with nature, it creates an elation, a sense of well-being, which makes everything else much more attractive. And as we know, many of the religious authorities from monotheistic cultures have had some problem with yoga precisely for that reason. because they know that yoga is good on the physical level, but they say, do not get into the philosophy of it because that's very dangerous. That will take you away from monotheism, from what you learned from your church or religion, and therefore you become relativistic. They have all sorts of names to give to it, and you become a pantheist, which means you believe God is everywhere, and in fact, according to them, God is one, but He's not everywhere. He has created the universe and created you, but the universe and you are not God, and you shouldn't mix up everything with God. So that's a fundamental critique and a fundamental reason for the condemnation that they lay on general on the spirit of Hinduism, of Sanatana Dharma, and therefore on yoga. But I think yoga is definitely one of the two ways in which the minds of most people in the world can be made to resonate with the ultimate spiritual truth. And another one is modern science, particularly quantum physics, because very few people can reject quantum physics. It's no longer possible. Therefore, the very nature of reality that quantum physics reveals, especially in some of its latest evolution, is such that it opens the door to understanding the cosmology that Hinduism and Buddhism have uncovered. And at that level, there is an element of seriousness, of credibility, which is undeniable. And that, of course, is where monotheistic religions devoid of that cosmological background have great difficulty because they can no longer harmonize their strict teachings with the very nature of reality. If everything consists of essentially a vast nothingness, if you want to call it that way, because we don't know how else to define it, then how can you can of course expect that there are higher creatures, much higher creatures than us, who could be called gods or demigods or angels, but you can't really expect a single being to be controlling everything and to be just running it like a boss runs a factory. So that's where the change in consciousness, the change in worldview opens the door to the Eastern traditions.
So there was a German traveler who came to India and came during the time of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, which is when Viceroy of India was Mountbatten. And he traveled all over the India, and he came to a conclusion that Krishna is God because he thought everybody else was working while he was playing flute. So very simple analogy, but he did that. And also in Srimad Bhagavatam, the one of the Purana of India, it's mentioned Ete cha amsha kalapamsha Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. It's a Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. So if many of the people who accuse of others of paganism or idolatry, if they read that words from Srimad Bhagavatam, they'll find that it has declared only one person as Bhagwan, that is Krishna. So they can stop accusing, especially Hinduism. And in Buddhism, you have Buddha. So also they should stop accusing of their paganism. And as far as Native American cultures go, I'm a big defender of their faith. And I think that when they consider Surya or sun as God, that should be accepted as a very real monotheistic tradition. In some parts of South America, where they consider moon as God, it should also be accepted as a sound monotheistic tradition. So we should stop blaming others because they are not blaming any of the institutional religions or the religions of the book. So the religions of the book should also stop blaming others. So according to us, calling anyone as pagan or heathen or kafir is not a good thing. And it just spreads hatred and it spreads cultural exclusion. And on that, I'll end here. I think today we had a fantastic show. And thank you, Mr. Kam Carpentier. You joined all the way from Delhi, which is on the other side of the globe for us. And we will continue to invite you for more such interesting topics. Our students are already giving a big thanks to you, and some of them who are watching. So all of you who are watching this show, celebrate the Yoga Day. This video will be out in another 2 hours. So all of you to view on YouTube as well. So thank you, namaskar, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye bye.